She begged for mercy, but mercy sent her something worse, a monster who refused to let her die alone. Rain fell in sheets across the abandoned warehouse district, each drop a whispered prayer to a god that had stopped listening years ago. Mira pressed herself against the rotting brick wall, her breath shallow, controlled, a habit born from survival in a world that hunted creatures like her. Half human, half vampire, fully unwelcome everywhere. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the rusted pipe, not from cold, from hunger, the kind that gnawed at your bones and made you question if mercy was a lie told to the weak. She'd been tracking the hunters for 3 days. Their scent was unmistakable, silver polish, gunpowder, and the metallic stench of blessed ammunition. They moved through the city like locusts, methodical, efficient, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. Tonight, they'd cornered something. Someone. A vampire. Mira heard him before she saw him, a sound between a gasp and a growl, desperate and fading. The hunters had him pinned in the far corner of the warehouse, their crossbows drawn, their mouths moving in Latin she didn't need to understand. Extermination, purification. The same lies they always told themselves. She could have walked away. Should have. Dhampirs didn't save vampires. It wasn't survival, it was suicide. But when she saw him, something in her chest fractured. He was young, maybe 30, with skin pale as moonlight and eyes the color of old blood. Beautiful in the way that only the dying are beautiful, all sharp angles and fading light. His clothes hung in tatters, and she could smell the infection on him, the wrongness of a vampire starved too long, his body beginning to consume itself from within. He'd been running, for weeks, maybe months, alone. The hunters didn't hesitate. The first bolt whistled through the air. Mira moved without thinking. She stepped into the space between death and mercy, her hand raised, and caught the bolt mid-flight. Silver burned her palm, but she didn't scream. Screaming was a luxury. Instead, she twisted her wrist and sent it sailing back toward the hunters with enough force to shatter bone. One of them went down, his arm bent at an angle that meant he'd never use it again. "Run," she whispered to the vampire, not looking back. He didn't move. Instead, he stared at her, really stared, as if trying to understand what he was seeing. A Dhampir, marked by heaven and hell in equal measure, useless to both sides. "Go," she hissed, and this time she turned to face the remaining hunters, her eyes beginning to shift gold at the edges. Not fully vampire, not fully human, something caught between, something that made even trained killers hesitate for just a moment too long. That moment was all she needed. She fought them with teeth and fury and the kind of desperation that comes from having nothing left to lose. Her hybrid blood made her faster than any human, stronger than most vampires. She was a ghost caught between two worlds, and tonight, she would be their nightmare. When the vampire finally understood what she was doing, when he realized she was dying for him, he moved. He didn't flee. Instead, he rose on shaking legs and stood beside her, and together they fought through the rain and the silver and the prayers. When it was over, 3 hunters were dead, and the vampire was gasping against her shoulder, his weight nearly dragging her to her knees. "Why?" he whispered, his breath cold against her neck. "You could have let them take me. You could have walked away." Mira didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too busy holding him up, too busy trying to remember how to breathe in a world that had never wanted her to survive this long. "Come," she finally said. "We have to move. There will be more." She took him to the only place she had, an abandoned chapel in the old cemetery where even the dead seemed reluctant to linger. There, in the darkness beneath a stained glass window that had shattered decades ago, she gave him what little she had: water, cloth, and the kind of silence that feels like forgiveness. He watched her the entire time, his crimson eyes never leaving her face. "I don't even know your name," he said, his voice still weak but growing stronger. "Mira," she answered, And you? Alexei, he whispered. I am. I don't remember anymore. She cleaned the silver burns from his skin and didn't ask why he was being hunted. She didn't ask how long he'd been alone. Some questions were mercies in themselves, the mercy of not knowing. As dawn approached, painting the broken windows in shades of amber and violet, Alexei reached out and took her hand. His fingers were ice, but his grip was certain. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting me die alone." Mira said nothing. She was too busy wondering if she'd just made the greatest mistake of her life, or if, perhaps, she'd finally found the only other creature in the world who understood what it meant to be abandoned by heaven and earth alike. She didn't hear the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching through the rain. She didn't know that a messenger was riding from the old territories with a summons and a crown. She didn't know that the vampire king had become aware of a half-breed girl who had defied his hunters, and that he was coming to see for himself what kind of creature dared to save one of his own. By morning, everything would change. The sun had barely surrendered the sky when they heard the carriage. Mira had spent the night keeping watch, her hybrid senses alert to every sound, every shadow that moved beyond the chapel walls. Alexei slept the deep sleep of the starving, a kind of death that looked almost peaceful. She'd wrapped him in the old altar cloth, careful not to touch the silver-threaded cross at its center. Even for her, even with blood from both sides flowing through her veins, some holy things still burned. The sound came like thunder, hoofbeats synchronized to an impossible rhythm, and the grinding of wheels that seemed too heavy for any ordinary carriage. Mira moved to the broken window, her jaw tightening. Her instincts screamed danger, but not the ordinary kind. This was something else, something ancient. The carriage was black as a sealed tomb, pulled by horses whose eyes glowed red in the pre-dawn gloom. The doors opened, and they emerged like smoke taking shape, 3 figures in dark silhouette, moving with the fluid grace of predators who had learned to walk on 2 legs centuries ago. A woman descended first, her skin luminous as bone china, her hair a cascade of midnight silk. She wore a gown that seemed stitched from shadow itself, and around her throat lay a choker of pure silver and diamonds. Behind her came 2 men, one with the bearing of a general, one with the predatory stillness of an executioner. And then he appeared. The vampire king descended last, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He was tall, impossibly tall, with skin so pale it seemed translucent, revealing the faint tracery of veins beneath the surface like a map of ancient roads. His hair was the color of ash, and his eyes. His eyes were the oldest thing Mira had ever seen. They held centuries in them, millennia, the weight of countless choices and countless dead. He wore a long coat of crimson velvet, and beneath it a shirt of pure white silk. At his chest lay a pendant shaped like a crown, fashioned from bone and silver. When he moved, even the rain seemed to part for him. Mira's hand went to the knife at her side, a pathetic defense, and she knew it. The king's gaze found her immediately, as if he'd known exactly where she would be, as if he'd always known. "The Dhampir," he said, and his voice was like the sound of earth settling over a grave, deep, inevitable, final. I wondered if the reports were accurate. They so rarely are. Mira stepped forward, positioning herself between the chapel entrance and the visitors. "Alexei is under my protection." The woman in the midnight gown laughed, a sound like breaking glass wrapped in silk. "Oh, how delicious. The half-breed thinks she can protect one of ours. Does she not understand what she's facing?" "I understand perfectly," Mira said, and her eyes began to shift, the gold overtaking the human brown. "I understand that you sent hunters to kill him. I understand that you fail, and I understand that this is not your territory." The general stepped forward, his hand moving to a blade at his side. But the king raised a single finger. The motion was barely perceptible, yet the general froze as if nailed to the earth. "What is your name?" the king asked, his gaze never wavering from her face. "Mira. And tell me, Mira, child of two bloods, why would you risk your life for a creature you've never met?" We do not typically inspire such loyalty. We inspire fear. We inspire hunger. We inspire the desire to see us dead. "He was starving," Mira said simply. "He was alone. The hunters were going to kill him." "Yes," the king said, and something ancient and sad moved across his face. "That is what we do. We hunt, we kill, we consume. It is our nature." "No," Mira replied. "It's your choice, and you chose differently. You came here instead of sending more hunters. You came yourself." Silence fell like snow. The king moved closer, and Mira could smell him. Old spices, winter air, and something else, something that smelled like power itself. He stopped inches from her face, and she forced herself not to step back. "You saved one of my own," he said quietly. "Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the debt that creates? In my court, in my world, such an act binds you. You are no longer free to walk away." "I don't want to walk away," Mira said. "I want him safe." The king's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, or might have been the opening of a trap. "Then you shall both come with us," he said, "to my estate, to my court. There he will be healed, and you." He paused, his ancient eyes studying her face as if reading something written on her skin. "You will discover what it means to be chosen by the king of the damned." Inside the chapel, Alexei stirred awake. He saw the carriage, the figures, the king, and his eyes widened with a mixture of relief and terror. "Majesty," he whispered, struggling to his feet. "Come," the king said, extending a hand that looked as delicate as glass, but felt, Mira somehow knew, as unbreakable as stone. "We are going home." Mira looked at Alexei. He looked back at her, a question burning in his crimson eyes. She took a breath and nodded. There was no other choice. There had never been another choice. The carriage doors opened wider, revealing an interior that seemed to stretch into impossible distances. Mira took Alexei's hand, human warm from her touch, stabilizing, and together they stepped into the darkness. Behind them, the chapel doors swung shut with a sound like finality. The woman in the midnight gown laughed again as the carriage began to move. "Oh," she whispered to the king, "how fascinating this will become. A Dhampir girl in your court, bound to a vampire you've decided to spare. The hunters will be absolutely furious. And the High Council?" She smiled, revealing fangs like daggers. "They will demand blood." The king said nothing. He simply stared out the window at the breaking dawn, his ancient fingers drumming against his knee in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral dirge. The estate emerged from the mist, like a memory of something that should have remained forgotten. It rose from the hillside in Gothic spires and crumbling stone, with windows like empty eyes watching the world from behind centuries of dust and decay. Yet as the carriage drew closer, Mira realized the ruin was deliberate, a calculated aesthetic. The gardens were precise despite their wildness, the pathways clear despite the tangled vines. This was a ruin maintained, preserved, honored, the king's court. When they entered, the vastness of it nearly broke Mira's mind. Corridors stretched into darkness, candlelit chambers revealed themselves one after another, and everywhere, there were paintings, centuries of paintings, faces of the dead, the damned, the chosen. She recognized some of them. Historical figures, saints, soldiers, lovers, all vampires, all immortal, all waiting in oils and canvas for eternity. "The Gallery of the Damned," the woman in midnight said, appearing at Mira's shoulder like smoke. "Our king's collection, every vampire he's ever turned, every choice he's ever made that didn't end in death." She smiled, It's quite extensive. Alexei was led away to the healing chambers, rooms deep beneath the earth where the oldest vampires rested and recovered. Mira watched him disappear down a spiral staircase, and something in her chest twisted with the fear that she wouldn't see him again. "Come," the king said, his voice gentle. "You look as if you're about to commit violence. Let me show you something." She followed him through corridors that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, past servants who moved like ghosts and guards who watched her passage with expressions mixing curiosity and hunger. Finally, they reached a chamber she would not forget, a library that defied comprehension. Books covered every surface, stacked floor to ceiling, some so old their bindings had turned to dust. The king moved through them as if they were old friends. "In the beginning," he said, running his fingers along a spine, "we were monsters, simple, hungry, driven by nothing but the need to feed. We burned cities, we shattered families. We were the nightmare that mothers used to frighten children into obedience." He pulled a volume at random. "This one is from 1347, plague times. We were blamed. Of course. The wrath of God sent in the form of pale creatures that drank blood. It was easier than admitting that disease came from fleas and filth." He turned to face her, and his ancient eyes held something that looked almost like regret. "Then we evolved," he continued. "We learned that immortality is only bearable when bound to purpose, when held accountable to something beyond ourselves. So we built courts. We created laws. We decided that some lives would be preserved and others would be ended with mercy rather than cruelty." He paused. "Do you know what changed us?" "No," Mira whispered. "Love," he said simply. "Love and the terrible choices it demands. Every vampire in my gallery made a choice, to become, to remain, to accept the price of forever. And every choice was born from love, for power, for beauty, for a mortal they couldn't bear to lose, for immortal companions they couldn't bear to outlive." He walked closer to her, and Mira could feel the weight of his centuries pressing down like atmosphere. "You saved Alexei," he said, "not because you loved him. You didn't even know him. You did it because you recognized something in him, the loneliness, the sense of being hunted, the knowledge that the world had decided you should not exist." His hand reached out and touched her cheek, and it was ice and fire at once. "You did it because you understood what it meant to be unwanted by both heaven and earth." "What do you want from me?" Mira asked. "Everything," the king replied, "and nothing. I want you to choose. That is the only price that matters in my court. Choice. Alexei chose to accept transformation when I offered it, centuries ago. He chose to remain even when the hunger threatened to consume his humanity. He chose to run rather than become the monster they wanted him to be. The king's hand fell away, and you chose to save him. Now I'm asking you to choose again." "Choose what?" "Whether you wish to remain human," he said, "or whether you wish to complete your transformation. Your father was human. Your mother was one of my bloodline, turned in 1893, hidden away when she realized she was carrying life. She died, trying to protect you. She chose mortality to give you a chance at freedom." Mira's breath caught. "How do you know that?" "Because I turned her," the king said, and for the first time she heard genuine sorrow in his voice. "Because I loved her, because I believed I could give her forever, and because I failed her when she needed me most. The hunters found her. She couldn't fight them, not while carrying you. So she gave you to a human family and told them to run." The library seemed to spin around Mira. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her nature, crystallized into a new shape. "I could make you like Alexei," the king continued. "Fully vampire. The hunters would never find you again. You would live forever. You would be part of my court. You would never again wonder if you truly belonged anywhere." "Or?" Mira asked, her voice shaking. Or you remain as you are, half-breed, unwelcome everywhere, hunted by both sides, free. He smiled, and it was the saddest expression she'd ever seen. I cannot force this choice. I can only offer it. Your mother taught me that. She taught me that love that is not chosen is merely ownership. Mira walked to one of the windows. Outside, the dawn was breaking, and she could see the world in all its terrible beauty, the mist rising from the valleys, the light breaking through the clouds like something being born. I need to think, she said. Of course, the king replied. You have until nightfall. Choose, and choose well, for tonight my council meets, and they will demand to know why a Dhampir walks freely in my halls. The answer you give will determine whether you leave this place as a guest or as a prisoner. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The healing chambers were deeper than Mira had imagined, carved from stone that predated human memory, illuminated by candles that burned with flames the color of blood. Alexei lay on a bed of silk and shadow, his body still broken but no longer starving. The vampire physicians had given him what he needed, the king's own blood, ancient and potent, flowing through his veins like liquid immortality. He was awake when Mira entered, his crimson eyes tracking her movement across the chamber. He looked stronger. He also looked terrified. They told me, he said quietly, what you are, what your mother was, why the king took an interest in you. Mira sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to touch him. Did they tell you about his offer? To turn you, Alexei said, to make you like us. He struggled to sit up, and Mira resisted the urge to help. Mira, you can't. You have to refuse. Why? She asked. You seem to think immortality was a gift. You speak of it as if you chose it. I did choose it, Alexei said, his voice rough with emotion. And I regret it every night I wake to see the sun rise without being able to greet it. I regret it every time I remember the taste of food, the warmth of another person's skin, the simplicity of belonging to a world that doesn't require blood to survive. He reached out and took her hand, and his fingers were warmer now, closer to alive. I chose this because I was young and afraid, and the king offered me forever. But forever is a prison, Mira. It's a beautiful prison, but a prison nonetheless. You could leave, she said. Nothing holds you here. Everything holds me here, Alexei replied. The debt, the blood, the knowledge that if I leave, the hunters will find me and the king will hunt me just the same. There is no freedom for my kind. There is only the careful balance between predator and prey. Mira pulled her hand away. Then why should I condemn myself to the same? Because, a voice said from the shadows, you have something Alexei didn't have when he was turned, the ability to choose it freely, knowing full well what it will cost. The woman in the midnight gown emerged from the darkness like she'd always been there. Up close, Mira could see that she was beautiful in a way that transcended physical form. Her beauty was the beauty of power, of choice made manifest in flesh. Her eyes were violet, ancient, and infinitely sad. I am Isabel, the woman said. I've been with the king since 1642. I chose him and he chose me, and together we chose this. She gestured around the chamber. And I would not trade a single night of it for all the daylight the world could offer. You're lying, Mira said. You have to be. I'm not, Isabel replied, and she smiled. But I'm also not going to convince you. That's not my role. My role is to tell you that the council has arrived, and they're demanding answers. The king is buying you time, but not much. And Alexei. She looked down at the young vampire. They're already whispering about him, that he's weak, that saving him was mercy wasted, that perhaps the hunters should have been allowed to finish the job. Alexei's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. How long do I have? Mira asked. The sun is setting, Isabel said. You have until full dark. After that, the king must present you to the court, and your fate will be decided by vote. Majority rule, of course. The king has final say, but using it too often creates resentment. Mira stood and began to pace. So either I become vampire and secure my place in the court, or I remain human and face exile or death. That's rather blunt, Isabel said, but accurate, although there is a third option. What? Mira asked. You could offer yourself as blood bond, Isabel said quietly. A human servant bound to the king by will and contract, you would remain human, but you would be under his protection. The hunters wouldn't dare touch you. The court wouldn't dare question you. And you would know the secret life we lead, the politics, the passion, the terrible choices that come with immortality. And in exchange? In exchange, Isabel said, you would give him what he most desperately needs, humanity, reminding him each day that there exists a world beyond blood and centuries, a world of mortality and consequence and genuine choice. It's a small price for salvation. Some would say it's no price at all. Mira looked at Alexei. He was shaking his head, his scarred lips forming words without sound. Don't do it. Don't bind yourself to him. But Mira was already moving toward the door. Where are you going? Alexei asked, panic rising in his voice. To make a choice, Mira said. To answer the king. To tell him that I refuse to become what I am not, and I refuse to become merely what I am. I'm going to offer a third path. She climbed the spiraling stairs, leaving behind the healing chambers and the candlelight. The great hall had been transformed. Torches burned along the walls, and the council sat in a semicircle, their eyes burning like coals. The king sat above them all, on a throne fashioned from bone and silver, his ancient face unreadable. When Mira stepped forward, the murmuring began, whispers of disbelief, of outrage, of intrigue. The Dhampir, one of the council members spat, a scarred vampire with the bearing of a general. Come to beg for her life? How pathetically mortal. Mira stepped closer to the king's throne. I've come to make an offer. An offer? The king leaned forward. Tell us, child of two bloods, what could you possibly offer to a court of immortals? Mira took a breath and spoke the words that would change everything. I offer you the truth, she said. You say that you are damned, that you are monsters, that you require a careful balance to remain sane. But you're tired of believing it. That's why you saved Alexei when you could have let the hunters kill him. That's why you brought me here when you could have destroyed me. That's why you're offering me choices instead of demands. She paused. I offer you a mirror. Someone who can remind you every day that immortality is a choice and that it's only meaningful if chosen freely. I offer you the humanity that keeps you from becoming the monsters you fear you are. Bind me to you by blood and will, and I will be your reminder that redemption is always possible. That love, even the terrible, impossible love between mortal and immortal, can be salvation instead of damnation. The council erupted, some in outrage, some in consideration, some in something that looked almost like approval. The king rose from his throne and descended the stairs toward her. When he stood before her, he extended his hand, and on his palm lay a pendant fashioned from his own bone, a crown, but smaller, worn. This was your mother's, he said. She wore it for 7 years before she died. It marks you as belonging to my bloodline, my court, my protection. He looked at her with eyes that held centuries of loneliness. Do you understand what you're offering? That you will age and die, and I will remain? That you will give your life to a creature who will watch you wither? Yes, Mira said simply, but I will give it freely. And in those years, we will create something that has never existed before, a bridge between mortality and eternity. We will prove that love can exist there. She took the pendant and clasped it around her throat. The moment it touched her skin, everything changed. She could feel the king's presence in her mind, ancient and vast and infinitely lonely. She could feel the connection binding them, not chains, but roots growing between them, anchoring them both to something real. The council fell silent. Isabel smiled from the shadows, and Mira realized that the woman had known all along what she would choose. The king reached out and touched her face, and for the first time in centuries, his eyes held something that looked like hope. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. 3 months passed like snow falling through darkness. Mira had been given chambers adjacent to the king's, a space that bridged 2 worlds. One window faced the human kingdom below, with its mortal lives and ordinary sorrows. The other faced inward, toward the vampire court, with its endless corridors and candle-lit chambers. She spent her days reading the king's library, understanding the weight of centuries written in leather and blood. She spent her nights learning the politics of immortality, sitting at court sessions where ancient grievances were settled with words and wit rather than violence. The king, she'd learned his name was Dorian, though he rarely used it anymore, never demanded anything of her. He was courteous, formal, distant in a way that kept her always reaching toward him. This, she understood, was deliberate. He was teaching her that immortality was the art of restraint, of choosing not to act even when you possessed the power to do so. Alexei had healed completely and had taken position as a knight in the king's guard. He watched Mira constantly, his eyes burning with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that looked almost like sorrow. On the nights when she passed him in the corridors, he would bow formally, never meeting her eyes. Tonight, the autumn equinox, the court gathered for a ceremony. Mira stood in her chambers, staring at herself in an ancient mirror that reflected not just her image, but something deeper. Her aura, Isabel had explained, the spiritual essence that marked her as belonging to Dorian's bloodline. She looked almost like a vampire now, though not quite. Her eyes held flecks of gold at the edges, and her skin had taken on a luminescence that marked her as something other than purely human. She was caught between, just as she'd always been. But this time, it was deliberate. This time, it was chosen. A knock on her door. Alexei entered without waiting for permission, and Mira could smell the urgency on him. Fear and rage and desperation all tangled together. "You have to leave," he said without preamble. "Tonight, you have to run." "What are you talking about?" Mira asked, though she already knew. She could feel it, a wrongness in the air, a gathering of power that felt like the moment before a lightning strike. "The High Council is meeting with the hunters," Alexei said, his words tumbling over each other. "There's an alliance being negotiated. They're going to demand your execution, your conversion to pure vampire, or the king's abdication. The hunters want the throne, Mira. They want to purge the court of mercy and rebuild it on blood and conquest." Mira turned away from him. "Why are you telling me this? It's treason." "Because," Alexei said, and his voice broke slightly, "I love you too much to watch you die. I loved you the moment you saved me in the rain, and I love you more with every night that passes. And I know that I have no right to that love, that you belong to the king by choice and bond, but I cannot stand silent and watch you sacrifice to their politics." Mira turned to face him. In the mirror behind him, she could see their reflections, one marked by eternity, one still touched by mortality, both beautiful and broken in their own way. "I'm not running," she said quietly, "and neither are you." "Mira, listen to me," she interrupted. "The king bound himself to me not just as a servant, but as an equal. That means I have standing in this court. It means my voice matters. And if the High Council is going to move against him, then I need to be there to defend him." She reached out and took Alexi's face in her hands. You saved the king's life countless times in centuries of service. Let me save it now. How? Alexei asked. And he looked so young, so lost, so desperately in love. They're coming with silver and righteousness and the power of the old families behind them. With truth, Mira said, and with something they can't fight, the reality of what immortality actually costs. She dressed quickly in a gown of deep crimson that Isabel had given her, a color reserved for the king's bloodbound, for those chosen by the throne. The pendant her mother had worn burned against her skin, warm and alive, connecting her to the vast presence that was Dorian. She could feel him reaching out to her through that connection, questioning, concerned, commanding her to stay in her chambers for her own safety. She ignored him and walked toward the great hall. The council was already gathering when she entered. Dorian sat upon his throne, looking ancient and exhausted, and around him stood the High Council, 7 vampires of extraordinary age and power, each one burning with a hunger for dominion that made even immortality seem insufficient. Behind them, to Mira's shock, stood human figures. Hunters. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the ecclesiastical courts, and their hands rested on weapons blessed with silver and holy water. They looked at her with the expression of those who have found their purpose. Mira, Dorian said, and his voice held a warning. You should not be here. I should be, she replied, walking toward the throne with deliberate steps. Because this concerns me. This concerns all of us. One of the council members, an ancient vampire whose scars suggested he'd fought in a dozen wars, stepped forward. The Dhampir has no standing to speak at a council session. Neither do they, Mira replied, gesturing to the hunters. Yet here they are. We stand here, one of the hunters said, stepping forward with the zealotry burning in his eyes, as representatives of the order that has fought to purge this world of abominations. We come to propose an alliance with the reasonable members of this court to restore balance, to return the hierarchy to what it should be. Humanity at the top, monsters in the dark, and those with the will to do what must be done in charge of the sword. Mira laughed, a sound like broken glass wrapped in silk. Do you know what your greatest weakness is? She asked. You assume that immortality makes us different from you, that it separates us into 2 categories, the damned and the saved. But it doesn't. It just reveals what we truly are beneath the masks of mortality. She turned to face Dorian. You saved Alexei because he was starving. You brought me here because I showed mercy to someone the world wanted dead. And now you're being asked to choose between your principles and your survival. She looked back at the hunters. And you think that's a weakness, but it's the only thing that makes us stronger than you. We choose to remember our humanity even as we transcend it. Pretty words, the scarred council member said. But they don't change the fact that we are weakening, that Dorian has lost the will to rule with proper strength. Then challenge him, Mira said. Take the throne through combat. That's your right, isn't it? According to your own laws? The chamber fell silent. This was forbidden. A Dhampir should never know the laws of the court. But more than that, she just offered them a path to their goal that didn't require the hunters at all. The scarred vampire smiled cruelly. I accept. I challenge Dorian of the Crimson Throne for dominion over this realm. Dorian rose from his throne slowly, and for the first time Mira saw him as he truly was. Not a man, not a vampire, but something far older and far more terrible. When he moved, the entire court seemed to hold its breath. The duel was brief and devastating. The scarred vampire was fast, skilled, marked by centuries of combat. But Dorian was older than memory, and his movements had the inevitability of death itself. When it was over, the council member lay in a pool of his own ancient blood, and Dorian stood unmarked, his face expressionless. Anyone else? He asked the chamber. No one answered. He turned to the hunters. You came into my home under false pretense. You came seeking alliance with my own court against me. This is the highest betrayal." He gestured, and guards moved forward to seize them. "You will be imprisoned until dawn, and then you will be released on the condition that you speak to your order. Tell them that the Vampire King still stands, that his court still follows, and that any hunter who enters this territory again will find their faith no salvation against what we have become." The hunters were led away, their faces burned white with shock and fury. The court members bowed, one after another, and Mira realized they had never truly doubted Dorian. They were simply testing him, watching to see if his age had made him soft. Now they knew. When all the spectators had filed out, Dorian descended from his throne and approached Mira. He looked down at her with eyes that were no longer ancient and weary, but alive with something she'd never seen before. Emotion, vulnerability, the mask finally slipped. "You could have died," he said quietly. "Yes," Mira replied, "but I chose not to." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Every night I fear I will destroy you, that my very presence in your life will be your doom, and every night you prove me wrong." "Then stop fearing," Mira said, "and start choosing. Choose me. Choose us. Choose that love can exist between the damned and the living." He drew her close, and she could feel his heartbeat, slow, deep, eternal, synchronizing with her own racing pulse. When he kissed her, it tasted like blood and redemption, and the terrible beauty of choosing damnation for love's sake. 6 months passed, and the seasons turned like the pages of an endless book. Mira's chambers had become a meeting place, a neutral ground where mortal and immortal concerns could be discussed without the weight of centuries of politics pressing down. She'd begun hosting salons, gatherings where the king's court could interact with carefully selected humans, philosophers, artists, poets, people who understood that the boundary between the living and the dead was far thinner than most believed. The court had begun to change around her, not dramatically, but noticeably. There was more laughter in the halls. The hunts, which were a necessity of their nature, had become more merciful, targeting criminals and the dying rather than the innocent. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Alexei had become her closest friend, and this complicated everything. He spent hours in her chambers, reading to her from the king's library, or simply sitting in companionable silence. The love he felt for her had become less a burning desperation and more a quiet acceptance. He loved her as one might love the sun, knowing it would never turn its face toward them, but grateful for the warmth it provided nonetheless. Tonight, on the eve of her 25th birthday, Mira stood before her mirror and examined the woman staring back at her. She was changing. The gold in her eyes was spreading, creeping across more of her iris with each passing month. Her skin had taken on a pearlescent quality, and she could feel her strength growing, her speed increasing, her hunger, carefully controlled, never acknowledged, growing sharper. She was becoming something new, something between, something that had never existed before. Isabel entered without knocking, as she always did, and smiled at Mira's reflection. "The king requests your presence," she said. "The entire court is gathering for your birthday ceremony. He has something to show you." The great hall had been transformed into something that took Mira's breath away. The walls were covered in mirrors, great sweeping mirrors of polished silver and ancient glass, and within each one, the reflection showed not the room, but a different scene. In one, the marketplace where Mira had been born. In another, the chapel where she'd saved Alexei. In a third, the stairs of the king's throne room on the night she'd bound herself to him. Dorian stood at the center of it all, wearing a gown of white silk that looked almost mortal in its simplicity. And in his hands he held a rose, ancient, preserved, never wilted. It was red as blood, deep as wine, beautiful as sorrow. "This was your mother's rose," he said as Mira approached. She gave it to me on the night I told her I could not make her immortal, that she was human and would remain human, and that I would watch her die just as I have watched countless others die. She wept, and this rose was at her feet, and she told me that even dying things could be beautiful. He placed the rose in Mira's hands, and it was surprisingly warm, almost alive. On this night on your 25th year, Dorian continued, and his voice carried through the chamber with the weight of ceremony, I present you with a choice. You have been with us for 6 months. You have proven yourself worthy of standing between worlds. You have shown that mortals and immortals can coexist with dignity and love. He paused. You can continue as you are, aging slowly, your lifespan extending as mine influences yours, becoming neither fully mortal nor fully immortal, but something entirely new. Or, he gestured, and a cup was brought forward. It contained wine that looked and smelled almost like blood. You can join us fully. Complete the transformation. Become immortal in truth. Remain with me forever, as your mother could not. Know the centuries as I know them. Have eternity to love, to grow, to choose renewal rather than resignation. The court watched, silent, waiting. Alexei stood in the shadows, his face carved from stone. Mira looked at the rose in her hands, at the red petals that had somehow survived preservation, at the thorns that could still draw blood. And she understood the choice her mother had faced: immortality or mortality, forever or finite, the promise of endless time or the mercy of ending. She turned to Dorian. If I accept immortality, she said, I will outlive everyone I've ever loved but you. I will watch the world change and change and change until I no longer recognize it. I will become what you are, eternal, distant, forever watching from the outside. Yes, Dorian said simply, that is the price. And if I refuse? Then we will have perhaps another 50, perhaps 100 years together, if you're fortunate. And then I will be alone again, as I have been for centuries. I will miss you, as I have missed your mother. And eventually, I will forget your face as I have forgotten so many other faces. Mira thought of the months she'd spent in his court. She thought of the cold beauty of immortal love, the way Dorian's hand felt in hers like stone and starlight. She thought of Alexei, waiting forever in the shadows, loving and aching and never asking for more. She thought of her mother, who had chosen to die rather than abandon her humanity. I will not choose immortality, Mira said quietly. I will choose to remain as I am. Dorian's face didn't change, but she felt the shock move through him like an earthquake through the earth. I am not refusing you, Mira continued. I am refusing fear. I am refusing the idea that love requires eternity to be real. I am choosing to live fully in the time I have, rather than half living in forever. She set the rose down carefully and took the cup of wine that wasn't wine from the table. But instead of drinking it, she poured it over the rose until it bloomed red with blood. I choose this, she said. I choose a rose that will die, but will be beautiful until it does. I choose a love that will end, but will be true while it exists. I choose mortality as an act of faith, faith that the time I have will matter more than the time I don't have. The court erupted in confused whispers. This was unheard of. No one had ever refused immortality. Dorian approached her slowly, and when he reached her, he took her face in his hands. There were tears on his ancient cheeks, the first tears Mira had ever seen him shed. You are, he said softly, the most immortal creature I have ever known, because immortality is not about duration, it's about meaning, and you have given meaning to every night I have lived that I could not find in centuries of forever. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, and the court watched in silence as a vampire king wept for a mortal woman who had chosen to remain mortal, not out of weakness, but out of love. Alexei stepped forward and placed his hand on Mira's shoulder, and she reached back and grasped it. In that moment, the three of them formed something sacred, the king and the knight and the girl who had chosen to die so that they might remember what it meant to live. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance. Autumn came early that year, and with it, darkness. Mira had spent the morning in the gardens, tending to the roses, her mother's rose among them, when she felt the intrusion in her mind. Not Dorian, something else, something violent and discordant. She was inside the castle before the alarm bells rang. The hunters had come in force, not a small delegation this time, but dozens, marked with the sigils of the church's highest authority. They'd breached the outer walls using a combination of explosives and blessed fire, and they were moving through the lower chambers with military precision. Dorian stood in the great hall, still dressed in white, and beside him stood the entire court. For the first time since Mira had known him, the king looked afraid. "They know," Dorian said quietly to her as she entered. "They know that I refused to take a human concubine to weaken myself. They know that I'm vulnerable in ways I have never been before. They're going to try to force immortality on you. If you're made vampire, if they believe I'm using you to create a dynasty, they'll have justification to burn this entire castle and everything in it." The hunters emerged into the hall like a flood, their leader stepping forward. He was ancient by human standards, maybe 70, with a face like cracked leather and eyes burning with righteousness. "Dorian," he said, his voice like gravel in a tomb. "I am Cardinal Dominic of the Eastern Church. I come with the authority of 5 councils and the mandate of all Christendom. You will surrender yourself and your court for judgment, or we will purify this place with holy fire." "I will not," Dorian said simply. "I am sovereign here. You have no authority." "We have this," Cardinal Dominic replied, and he gestured to the hunters. They raised their weapons, crossbows, flamethrowers, blessed ammunition that would burn through vampire flesh like acid. Mira stepped forward. "Stop," she commanded, and her voice carried surprising power. The hunters hesitated. The gold in her eyes had spread until nearly half of each iris burned with it, and she knew what they were seeing. Something between human and monster, neither fully one nor the other. "I am Mira," she said, "and I am the bloodbound of this king. I came to your world to save a creature you would have destroyed, and in doing so, I learned that the line between damnation and salvation is far thinner than your scriptures teach." "You are corrupted," Cardinal Dominic spat, "possessed by demonic influence." "No," Mira replied, "I am enlightened. I have seen both sides of the veil that separates immortal from mortal, damned from saved, and I tell you now, there is no veil, there is only choice." Alexei moved to her side, his hand on his sword. "If you fire one weapon," he said quietly, "I will kill every hunter in this hall before they can reload." "Then your death will be justified," Cardinal Dominic said, and he gave the signal. The hunters fired. What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats. Dorian moved faster than mortal eyes could follow, placing himself in front of Mira, and the blessed bolts struck him like lightning. They didn't pierce his skin. His vampire nature was too ancient, too strong. But they burned, and the smell of seared flesh filled the hall. Alexei fought with the desperation of the damned, his movements a blur of steel and supernatural strength. He took down 3 hunters before a blessed bolt caught him in the shoulder, and he went to one knee with a sound of primal pain. Isabel and the other council members had begun to respond when Mira did something that no one expected. She threw off the pendant her mother had worn. The moment it left her neck, the connection to Dorian's bloodline snapped, and her hybrid nature reasserted itself. The human side and the vampire side, no longer balanced, began to war within her body. It was agonizing. Her eyes burned. Her skin felt like it was being flayed from the inside. Her bones seemed to shift and reshape. She was becoming fully one or the other. She didn't know which, and the pain was so absolute, so consuming, that she nearly screamed. The hunters stopped firing. They were staring at her as if they were watching God's judgment made manifest. In the chaos, Dorian caught her before she fell. She could see his lips moving, hear him calling her name from very far away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I had to—" "Hush," he said, and his voice was tenderness itself. I know. He bit her wrist, not violently, but gently, his fangs breaking skin, and he drank. Just a little. Just enough to pass his blood into her body, to anchor her transformation, to give her a choice about what she would become. The pain stopped. What replaced it was clarity. Absolute, blinding clarity. She could feel the currents of magic flowing through the castle. She could sense the life in the hunters' bodies, the pulse of their blood, the rhythm of their hearts, the fear and certainty burning in their minds. She was still changing, still becoming something new, but now she had agency in that transformation. She rose to her feet, and when she opened her eyes, they were completely gold. "No!" Cardinal Dominic shouted. "She's been turned. She's one of them now." "No," Mira said, and her voice had become something other, layered with harmonics, resonating with power. "I have chosen my path. I have chosen to be fully what I am, without apology or shame." She turned to look at the cardinal, and he stumbled backward at what he saw in her face. "You believe that your God condemns creatures like us. But I tell you this, if there is a God, she does not damn the choices made in love. She does not curse the monsters who choose mercy, and she certainly does not save those who kill innocents in her name." She gestured, and the hunters found themselves paralyzed, not by force, but by the sheer weight of her presence. She was not fully vampire, but she was also no longer mortal. She existed in the space between, fully present in both worlds. "Leave," Dorian commanded, and his voice held all the authority of centuries. "Take your cardinal and your zealotry and leave this place. You will not return, and if you do, you will find that my mercy has been exhausted." The hunters released, shocked and terrified, dragged themselves and their leader toward the exit. In moments they were gone, and the great hall fell into silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Alexei was on his knees, the blessed bolt still in his shoulder. Mira went to him and gently removed it, and she could feel the poison burning in him, could sense the pain in his mind. "Let me," she said, and she brought her wrist to his lips. He resisted. "Mira, no, you're still—" "Changed," she confirmed. "I'm aware. Now drink." His fangs extended, and he bit gently, and he drank from her, and she could feel what she was giving him. Not fully vampire blood, but something else, something that burned like fire and tasted like redemption. With each pull, the blessed poison was flushed from his system, replaced by her hybrid essence. When he released her wrist, his eyes were wide with wonder. "You," he whispered, "are extraordinary." Mira turned to Dorian. The king was staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. She could feel the shock in his mind through the bond that still connected them. "I'm sorry," she said. "I couldn't let you take the bolts alone." "You gave up immortality," Dorian said quietly. "You cast off the pendant. You cut yourself free from my bloodline." "No," Mira replied. "I evolved it. I chose to complete my transformation on my own terms, with my own will. I am still bloodbound to you, but now it's not through dependency, it's through choice." She extended her hand to him, and he took it. Where their skin touched, something remarkable happened. Gold and crimson light spiraled outward, filling the hall with illumination that looked almost like salvation. The court knelt, one by one, until every vampire had bowed before the creature that was neither fully one of them nor fully their former prey. Mira had become something mythical, something that walked in both the light and the darkness, fully present in both worlds. Alexei rose to his feet and knelt as well, and the submission was so complete, so utterly genuine, that Mira felt tears on her cheeks. "What are you?" Dorian asked, and his voice held infinite tenderness. "I'm the bridge," Mira replied. "I'm the proof that we can exist between extremes, that love can create something new, something that transcends the old boundaries. I'm what your mother dreamed of being, and what you feared I would lose myself becoming." She squeezed his hand. "I'm home." 1 year had passed since the night Mira became something entirely new, and the castle had transformed along with her. The gardens, once a place of Gothic decay, had bloomed into something luminous and alive. The roses grew in profusion, red and gold and white, and they never withered. The halls, once filled with the cold silence of eternal nights, now echoed with laughter and music and the sounds of a court learning to remember what joy felt like. Humans came to the castle now, not as servants or prey, but as guests. Artists, philosophers, lovers, and dreamers came seeking the rumors of a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had been not erased, but transformed into something breathtaking. Mira stood in her chambers on the anniversary of her transformation, watching the sun set through windows that no longer burned her eyes. She could walk in daylight now if she chose, though the night remained her truest home. Her hybrid nature had evolved beyond anyone's understanding, and she had become the thing that most vampires considered a myth, a creature that could exist in both the day and the night. There was a knock on her door. Not Dorian, not Alexei, but Isabel, carrying a letter sealed with wax that smelled of earth and starlight. "From the High Council of the Church," Isabel said, setting the letter on Mira's table. "They want to negotiate a treaty. They want your help in creating a formal separation between their world and ours. They're finally accepting that we cannot be destroyed, and that perhaps we should not be." Mira opened the letter and read the careful diplomatic language. It was, she realized, an act of surrender masquerading as statesmanship. The church was acknowledging that the old ways of extermination had failed, and they wanted to establish borders, boundaries, agreements about when and where the supernatural could exist. "What will you tell them?" Isabel asked. "I'll tell them," Mira said, "that peace is possible, that we can coexist, that neither of us needs to destroy the other." She smiled sadly. "I'll tell them that I am living proof that even the most impossible loves can transcend the boundaries that should separate them." That night, the court gathered in the great hall once more. Dorian sat on his throne, but Mira stood beside him, not beneath him, their hands linked. Alexei stood at the king's other side, his sword resting across his chest. Not as a weapon, but as a symbol of protection. Mira opened the treaty to the assembled court and began to read. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of change moving through the world. Not sudden, not violent, but inexorable. The old ways were dying. A new age was dawning, one where the supernatural and the mortal could begin to acknowledge each other's existence without the compulsion to destroy. When she finished reading, she looked out at the gathered court, ancient vampires, creatures that had fed on humans for centuries, beings that should have been monsters, but who had learned, through her presence and her example, that redemption was always possible. "This is the gift we give the world," Mira said. "Not surrender, but transformation. Not the end of what we are, but the beginning of what we might become." Dorian rose and took her hand, and together they walked out onto the balcony that overlooked the kingdom. Below, humans went about their lives, unaware of the supernatural realm that existed just beyond their perception. Above, stars began to emerge as true night fell. "Do you regret it?" Dorian asked. "Becoming what you are, Mira leaned against his side, and she could feel his heartbeat, slow, eternal, infinite, synchronizing with her own. Her transformation had not stopped, she realized. It would never stop. Every night, she was becoming more, evolving further, creating new possibilities within herself. "No," she said simply. "I regret nothing. I chose this. I chose you. I chose to believe that love could exist between the damned and the living, and I was right." Alexei joined them on the balcony, and the three of them stood together as night fell fully. Behind them, the castle blazed with candlelight. Before them, the world slept, unaware that it had been forever changed. Mira felt the weight of what she had become, not immortal, but transcendent, not damned, but transformed, not dead, but more alive than she had ever been. She was the bridge between worlds. She was the proof that love could survive eternity. She was the woman who had saved a starving vampire and had been saved, in turn, by love itself. And as the stars emerged overhead and the moon rose silver and certain, she understood at last what her mother had known, that dying things could be beautiful, that the most profound immortality was the kind you gave to another person's memory, and that some choices, once made, echoed through eternity with a sound like redemption. The castle bells tolled midnight, and in that moment the entire supernatural world shifted, acknowledging the existence of a new order. One where the vampire king ruled not through terror, but through the transformation of hearts. One where a half-breed girl with gold-burning eyes stood as proof that the impossible was possible. One where love was the only immortality that truly mattered. Dorian brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of devotion that contained within it centuries of loneliness, finally healed, forever secured not by chains, but by choice. "Forever?" he asked softly. Mira smiled, and in her smile was the answer. Not forever. Something better. Something chosen, night after night, freely and completely. A love that transcended duration and spoke only to depth. "For as long as I live," she replied, "and perhaps beyond. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned."